Uranus wasn't supposed to matter. No one fought wars over it. No one colonized it. No one even pretended it held anything but frozen indifference. A planetary footnote. It had swallowed every probe, shrugged off every sensor sweep, and yielded nothing but a slow, silent churn of methane storms and nitrogen ice. And yet, here we were. I stood at the main viewport of the Nautilus, watching the clouds turn in slow-motion violence beneath us. Not a real window, of course. Glass couldn't handle space, much less the winds below. Just a high-fidelity projection. I'd seen Uranus from a distance before, but up close it looked aberrant. The colors weren't the soft blue from the textbook images. Here it was the color of old bruises, streaked with ochre clouds and deep voids where the atmosphere folded in on itself. Beyond the viewport, nothing moved except the storms. We were the only living things in 1.8 billion miles. The crew had stopped watching hours ago. Interest waned quickly out here. The first few days we still looked, still let the awe sink in. But as always, the work came, and awe turned to routine, or distraction. This was supposed to be simple. Orbital survey, spectral analysis, probe deployment, a cold rock under colder clouds. Except it wasn't. I flicked through the sensor readings on my wrist terminal. The anomaly hadn't moved, not yet, but it was still radiating. That was what bothered me. The persistence. Thermal signals should fade. They should diffuse into the atmosphere and die, swallowed by the planet's entropy. This one wasn't. "Saul, you're obsessing again." Commander Gentry had that tone again. The one he used when he thought I was spiraling. He was a military man in a scientist's uniform, all hard angles and quiet authority. He'd spent too many years keeping men alive in places they shouldn't have been. He didn't like when people fixated. "I'm not obsessing," I said. "I'm watching a pattern." Gentry sighed, stepping up beside me. He didn't look at the storm. He was past that. Just crossed his arms and watched me instead. "Dr. Langston, we have 3 more days of survey time before we move to the next site. If this anomaly isn't actionable, it gets logged and left behind." "I know." "Then stop acting like it's personal." That made me look at him. "You ever seen a heat source sustain itself without fuel?" He didn't answer, just held my stare for a moment, then turned and walked back toward the command station. I exhaled through my nose, then turned back to the viewport. He wasn't wrong. I had a habit of fixating. It had been drilled into me over decades of fieldwork, of reading the deep layers of dead planets, of mapping the ghosts of things that once moved but didn't anymore. You had to be obsessive to do this work. Behind me, the rest of the crew murmured over their consoles, reviewing data. There were 5 of us. Gentry, myself, Nash, O'Leary, and Wesley. 5 men locked in a metal shell, watching a storm. It wasn't loneliness, not exactly. Just a kind of silence that never left, even when people spoke. Wesley was arguing with O'Leary again, some technical detail about the probe deployment schedules. Nash sat with his usual clinical detachment, writing up the latest telemetry. He liked to joke that he was here for the same reason as the probes, to collect data, send it home, and be forgotten. I turned away from the viewport, pushed off toward my station. The ship was small but functional, built with the same utilitarian coldness as every other ISA deep space vessel. Tight corridors, padded walls, equipment bolted in place. Everything designed for efficiency, not comfort. It didn't need to be livable, just survivable. I pulled up the latest spectrographs. The readings were getting stranger. Infrared suggested a structure at least 5 kilometers wide. Not uniform, not natural. The thermal fluctuations weren't from internal heat. It was scattering the energy, like it was trying to blend in, like it was masking itself. I rubbed the back of my neck. I should have felt excited, but all I felt was something curling deep in my gut. Not fear, just a sense that something was about to change. We sent the first drill down an hour later. It took 20 minutes to descend through the upper layers. The storm battered it, but it held steady, transmitting grainy LiDAR scans as it tunneled downward. O'Leary kept up his usual sarcasm. He narrated the descent like a sports announcer, making bets on whether we'd just find ice or actual solid ground. But when the drill hit the anomaly, it didn't stop. It didn't even register an impact. We checked the data 3 times. The drill should have hit solid ice, but instead, it punched through like it was sinking into flesh. Then the heat reading spiked. We watched in silence as the spectrographs shifted, showing something underneath the surface flexing. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't equipment failure. The structure had reacted. I didn't realize I was gripping the console until Nash put a hand on my shoulder. "Saul, I don't think it's ice." The words landed like a stone in my stomach. I looked at Gentry. He was already watching me. No one spoke for a long moment. Then finally he nodded once. "All right," he said. "We go deeper." The initial scans showed a surface layer that wasn't entirely solid, more like a lattice of material, interwoven and porous, designed to mimic geological formations. But that wasn't the part that stopped me cold. It was the fact that the puncture was already closing itself. I watched the footage again, running it back frame by frame. The drill's narrow core sample had been punched clean through, but instead of remaining open, the wound sealed itself in less than 90 seconds. No fluid, no outward reaction, just a slow, organic knitting of the material, like a wound scabbing over in fast forward. It was alive. I didn't say it outright. I knew what that word did to people in this line of work. Alive changed the mission. It changed who was in charge. If I said it now, the ISA would strip us of jurisdiction, send in a corporate or military cleanup team, and we'd be reduced to footnotes in the discovery logs. Gentry must have sensed where my thoughts were going because he didn't give me time to speak. "You're sure the breach is closed?" he asked. Nash nodded. "Thermal readings show no significant heat loss, no structural collapse. Whatever this thing is, it's self-repairing." O'Leary leaned forward in his chair, fingers tapping against his console. He had that look he got when he wanted to joke, but wasn't sure if the moment could handle it. "So, just to clarify," he said, "we drilled into a 5-kilometer-wide frozen tumor, and instead of bleeding, it healed itself." Nobody laughed. I studied the data again, fingers tightening on my console. The readings were consistent, logical, empirical, and still they made no damn sense. "If this was biological," I said slowly, "it should have broken down long before now. Organic material doesn't survive at this depth." Wesley exhaled through his nose. "Then it's not organic." "Then what the hell is it?" O'Leary muttered. We fell silent, the sound of the ship's ventilation system filling the space between us. The gentle hum of life support, the soft beeps of our instruments. Beneath it all, the knowledge that we weren't alone anymore. Gentry leaned against the bulkhead, arms crossed. He was weighing the situation, the same way he always did. The same way he had when our probe detected the anomaly, when I insisted on drilling in the first place. "We continue," he said. "Controlled descent. Take a core sample and bring it aboard. We'll analyze it directly." 10 minutes later, we sent down a secondary drill, smaller than the first. This one wouldn't penetrate too deep, just enough to extract a contained sample and pull back before it could self-repair again. We prepped containment measures, sterile environment, minimal exposure. The kind of precautions you took with an alien biohazard, even if we weren't ready to call it that yet. The drill descended. The moment it breached the surface again, the structure reacted differently. We saw the shift in infrared first, a slow, creeping change in heat distribution, like a ripple through the material. Before it had been passive, letting us drill through it. Now it was anticipating the breach. I watched the numbers on my display change. "It knows we're here," I murmured. The drill cut 2 centimeters deep before resistance spiked. Then a sudden drop. We stared at the readings, confused. Nash pulled up the seismic data. "The hell?" he muttered. "That's an empty pocket. An internal void buried beneath the structure. We had just punctured a layer that wasn't solid all the way through." I opened my mouth to say something, but before I could, the heat signature shifted again. Beneath the drill, something moved. It wasn't a reaction to us. It was a reaction to the exhaust. I flicked through the telemetry. The ship's fusion core had just vented excess heat. Standard cycling, a routine purge of built-up thermal energy from the reactor, dumping it into the atmosphere to prevent overload. Normally, it would dissipate harmlessly into the void, lost in Uranus's deep cold. But not this time. This time, the exhaust had bled directly into the excavation site. The numbers on my screen climbed. Not a normal heat dispersion curve, not diffusion, absorption. The structure wasn't just interacting with external energy, it was metabolizing it. I felt my pulse hammer against my ribs. Before, it had just been sitting there, inert. Now, it was pulling heat into itself, drawing in every available joule of energy like a frozen lung taking its first breath. The pressure readings changed again. I looked at the storm data feed. The flow had shifted. A slow, unnatural rotation, deviating from Uranus's natural wind shear. The storm wasn't just moving, it was responding. And beneath it all, something in the deep structure continued to stir. Without warning, the ship convulsed. A deep groan ran through the hull, not from an external impact, but from the ship itself. Our reactor alarms flared, flashing warnings across the main screen. I looked down at my terminal and felt my stomach twist. The fusion reactor's power output had just increased. Not by much, but enough to register. Enough to tell me that something was interfering with the equilibrium. "This isn't us," Nash said. This isn't..." Then he stopped. We all saw it at the same time. Atmospheric pressure had changed. Above the excavation site, the storm's behavior was shifting, its movement patterns breaking from their normal trajectories. The clouds twisted in a new configuration, forming something that shouldn't have been possible in this pressure gradient. The structure wasn't moving, but the atmosphere was. Uranus's storms had never deviated like this before. Never. Not in centuries of observation. O'Leary let out a nervous chuckle. It didn't sound real. So, anyone else thinking we should leave?" Gentry was already on the comms, calling up to the ship's AI. "Reactor diagnostics." The automated system responded. "Fusion core thermal regulation, variance detected. Internal temperature flux, positive 3.4 kelvins. Warning, unstable heat dissipation in local atmosphere." I barely had time to process it before Nash's voice cut through in. "We've got instability in the reactor's venting cycle. Output's creeping up." "Define creeping," Gentry said, already pushing off toward the command console. 0.04% increase. Not dangerous, but it shouldn't be happening at all. A number that small shouldn't have sent a spike of unease down my spine. But things in space didn't just creep. There was no gradual, natural shift. Either something was active, or it was dead. "Could be an instrumentation error," Wesley said, though there was no real confidence in his voice. "We're dealing with weird thermals." I ran a hand over my face. The exhaustion was creeping in. "No, it's not an error." I turned back to the viewport projection. Uranus's storms had never looked predictable, but now they looked erratic. The cyclone patterns had been stable for centuries, until now. The cloud movements had broken formation, fragmenting and curling into configurations that weren't random anymore. A shift in the distribution of trace gases, a slight deviation in wind shear, small changes that, on their own, wouldn't mean much. But together, they told me something I didn't want to say out loud. Uranus's atmosphere was reacting to the energy shift. "All right," Gentry said, exhaling. "We've seen enough. Shut down the reactor exhaust. Cut the heat leakage." Nash was already moving. "Aye, shutting down the auxiliary vents." The ship shuddered again, less pronounced this time. A shift in how weight distributed through the structure. Not turbulence, not mechanical. Something external. I saw it first on the infrared telemetry. A deep, buried thermal signature shifting under the surface structure. The anomaly was no longer passive. O'Leary let out a nervous chuckle. "You're all seeing that, right? That's not just..." "We see it." Gentry's voice was tight. "What's the depth?" Nash pulled the numbers. About 300 meters below the initial shell. He hesitated. And it's growing. Growing? Wesley asked. Nash tapped the screen. Thermal mass is increasing, like it's drawing from something. Get me a molecular composition on that heat source, I said. I want to know what the hell we're looking at. I don't think we have instruments calibrated for... Nash stopped. The data changed again. The pressure shift inverted. For a split second, something inside Uranus's atmosphere contracted instead of expanding. Nothing on this scale should be able to move like that. Not a storm, not a geological process, not anything we'd catalogued before. Wesley exhaled through his nose, staring at the numbers. That's not possible. In the distance, beyond the projection screens, the planet kept shifting, like something stirring beneath a frozen ocean. Then the drill stopped transmitting. O'Leary flinched at his console. We just lost the drill feed. Signal interference? Gentry asked. No, I mean, we lost it. It's not there anymore. He brought up the feed, rewound the footage. The last frame showed something reaching up from the void beneath the excavation site. Something liquid, a dense, gelatinous shape. Not entirely solid, but not free-flowing either. A structure in flux, adjusting its physical state at a molecular level, like it was trying to determine what shape to take. Then the drill feed cut to static. O'Leary leaned back in his seat, running both hands through his hair. I hate this, he muttered. Wesley exhaled. We need to leave. It should have been a straightforward call. It should have been obvious. But I couldn't look away from the screen. This wasn't just a biological organism. It wasn't just alive. It was something else. Something engineered. Langston, Gentry said, voice hard. We need a call. If we leave now, we don't find out what it is. If we stay, Wesley said, we end up in the same place as that drill. I looked back at the screen, at the infrared telemetry, where something huge and slow continued shifting beneath the clouds. A static interference came through the comms channel. Not words, not whispers, not a voice. Something deeper, a resonance, vibrating at the edge of perception, pressing against the inside of my skull like a half-formed thought. A pattern unfolding, not meant for human minds. And I understood in the same way you understand the shape of a wave before it breaks against the shore. It had noticed us, and it was watching back. I braced against the console, throat dry, stomach tight. The others felt it too. O'Leary had gone pale. Nash had locked his jaw, his eyes darting between the sensor data and nothing in particular, like he was trying to rationalize what didn't fit. Wesley was the first to move, pushing back from his station like he could physically remove himself from the moment. But the worst reaction was Gentry's. He didn't move at all. He just watched the screen. The thing beneath the ice, the growing thermal mass, the slow shifts in atmospheric pressure. All of it. His breathing was steady, measured. I had worked with him long enough to know that meant he was holding back something worse. The deep space veteran, the man who had been through more orbital catastrophes and high-stakes failures than the rest of us combined. And he wasn't saying a goddamn word. That's when I knew. We were past the point of control. Pull the reactor feeds, he said finally. Hard shutdown. Nash hesitated. That'll take auxiliary offline. We'll lose all external... I don't care, do it. The weight in his voice wasn't anger. It wasn't even fear. It was resignation. I turned back to the sensor feed, and for the first time, I saw the truth in the data. It wasn't just a structure. It wasn't a buried, passive thing we had accidentally disturbed. The self-repairing shell, the adaptive lattice mimicking geological formations, the way it absorbed external energy, how it had been waiting for an input it recognized. It was never dormant. It had been preserved, kept in deep freeze, and we had just given it what it needed to wake up. Nash's fingers moved over his console, cutting power to the reactor exhaust, initiating a hard shutdown. The energy output rerouted, the hum of the ship's systems momentarily dipping before stabilizing into a new, quieter baseline. But the second we cut power, the readings spiked again. Pressure shift, thermal expansion, reactive movement below the surface. I barely had time to register what I was seeing before the ship lurched violently, alarms screaming through the bridge. My shoulder slammed into the bulkhead, pain spiking through my ribs as the ship's inertial dampeners struggled to compensate. I pulled myself up, trying to focus on the console, but the numbers kept changing too fast. Density fluctuations in the atmosphere, wind shear reversal. The storm was warping itself around something deep in the clouds. Nash was still gripping his console, reading from his display. The heat isn't dissipating. It's pooling. I looked at the external camera feed. The cloud layers below us had begun to deform, pressure differentials creating a vast, unnatural vortex, something that didn't behave like a normal storm system. The flow of the methane-nitrogen layers had broken apart into chaotic instability, funneling downward, swirling in slow patterns, like the planet itself was being rewritten from the inside out. And I knew, with a clarity I didn't want, that's exactly what was happening. "We cut power," Nash said, shaking his head. "Why is it still accelerating?" I gripped the console harder, because it wasn't about our power anymore. The reactor had just been a catalyst, a starting point. It had been designed to absorb ambient energy, to wait until the right input reactivated its metabolic state. We hadn't turned it on. We had just given it enough momentum to wake up. And now, Uranus itself was sustaining the process. I turned to Gentry, but he was already a step ahead, hitting the ship-wide comms. "All crew to stations. We're aborting the mission." But the moment he moved toward the navigation controls, the ship jerked again. We all felt it, a gravitational shift. The weight distribution changed. Not a lot, not enough to destroy the ship, but enough to tell us something had just altered the planet's mass distribution. My vision blurred for a second as the artificial gravity corrected itself. Nash's hands hovered over his console, waiting for the numbers to settle into something readable. And when they did, he went completely still. "That's not possible." His voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear it. Nash's hands clenched into fists. "The core density is changing." "Core?" I stopped, mind catching up. "You mean the planet?" He nodded slowly. I looked back at the swirling storms, at the new formations taking shape in the abyss below. Uranus's interior was composed of rock, water, methane ice, and ammonia. Its core should have been static, locked in extreme pressures beneath thousands of kilometers of dense gas. But now, something at the molecular level was shifting. If the numbers were real, if what Nash was seeing was real, then whatever we had unearthed wasn't just alive. It was restructuring the planet itself. My body felt numb, empty, like something inside me had already accepted what came next. We weren't leaving. Even if we burned the reactor at full thrust, even if we went to full emergency acceleration, we wouldn't clear the mass distortion in time. The gravity flux would lock us in place, or worse, drag us down. Gentry took it all in. He wasn't moving, wasn't speaking. He turned, and I saw it in his face. Not just calculation, not just command decisions. Acceptance. He knew what had to be done. And the worst part, so did I. I took a slow breath, let the realization settle into my bones. There was no choice left. This thing was going to fully awaken, whether we wanted it to or not. It was going to consume and rewrite everything it had started, its process already running beyond anything we could stop. And if it didn't stop here, if we let it run its course, there was no telling what it could become. So we had only one thing left to do. We would burn the ship, burn ourselves, and take it with us. Gentry's voice was steady, the kind of tone that came when a man had already accepted his fate. "We initiate a controlled overload," he said. "Focus the blast downward. Take this thing with us." No hesitation, no wasted words, just a simple, brutal statement of fact. Nash swallowed, his hands hovering over the reactor controls. "Even if we time the detonation perfectly, we don't know if—" "We don't have to be sure," Gentry cut in. "We just have to make it impossible for it to survive intact." I exhaled through my nose. My hands were shaking, but I curled them into fists and forced them to be still. He was right. There was no other option left. We had been the match that lit the fire. If we didn't put it out, it would keep burning. The ship gave another lurch, something deep beneath the planet's cloud layers shifting again. The storms had fully broken formation now, forming an unnatural vortex, pulling inward toward the anomaly. I forced my mind to stay locked on what needed to be done. We only had minutes, maybe less. "I'll run the containment field diagnostics," Wesley said. "We need a vector detonation to focus the collapse downward." "Nash, purge the core limiters," Gentry ordered, "and someone override the goddamn emergency fail-safes before the ship locks us out." O'Leary let out a breath. God, I hate this job. Tell me this thing doesn't have a backup plan. I had been thinking the same thing. The anomaly wasn't moving to stop us, but it had reacted to everything else. The drill, the reactor exhaust, the storm pressure. Would it react to the threat of destruction? I pushed the thought away. It didn't matter, we had no other move. Fail-safes overridden, limiters off, core prepped for a full containment breach. The ship groaned again, more violently this time, as if something external was gripping it. "What's our blast yield?" Wesley scanned the calculations. "If we vent the entire reaction chamber into the excavation site, thermal saturation should exceed 10,000 Kelvin. That should be enough to disrupt the lattice integrity." "Should be?" O'Leary asked. I didn't want to say it. Didn't want to admit that we were still guessing. Because this wasn't normal physics anymore. This thing didn't behave like a biological life form. It didn't behave like a machine either. It was somewhere in between, designed to endure beyond our ability to comprehend time. And that terrified me more than anything. "This will work," Gentry said. Not because he knew it would, but because he had decided it had to. I exhaled, nodding, setting detonation for a full thermal collapse. Nash glanced at me, something unreadable in his expression. "This is it then?" I met his eyes. "Yeah." O'Leary let out a breath. "Well, if this thing somehow lives through a direct reactor breach, then I officially quit." Wesley smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You can lodge your resignation in hell." Nash made a low, almost humorless chuckle, then turned back to the console. "Setting detonation sequence. 5-minute countdown." I didn't waste time watching the numbers tick down. It wasn't real until the final seconds. Instead, I turned toward the viewport projection one last time. The vortex had tightened into something vast and unnatural, the atmosphere collapsing inward toward the point where we had drilled through the shell. And down there, in the abyss, the deep structure moved again, like the slow rhythm of something learning how to wake up. I pressed my fingers to the edge of the console, watching. This thing had been here long enough to become part of the planet itself, long enough for its shell to be indistinguishable from the ice, for its presence to be hidden beneath storms that had raged for longer than we had been looking at the sky. It had been meant to stay buried, or at least it had stayed buried until now. Had we uncovered it before it was ready? Or had we simply been the latest fools in a cycle that had played out long before us, and would play out again, long after we were gone? The core breached in a violent eruption of plasma, detonating with the force of a small star. The blast collapsed inward, energy funneled directly into the excavation site. For the briefest second, I thought I saw something moving in the center of the vortex, writhing against the pull of destruction. Then the void swallowed us whole. The wreckage of the Nautilus drifted in the upper atmosphere for days, scattered wreckage burning away as it sank further into the gas giant's crushing depths. By the time ISA's long-range probes returned to survey the area, the anomaly was gone. No structure, no heat signatures, no evidence it had ever been there at all. Uranus's storms had reconfigured, now cycling in an unfamiliar pattern, but nothing conclusive. The final transmissions from Nautilus were fragmented, incomplete. A scrambled voice log, partial sensor data. One garbled message faint through the static, a voice barely recognizable through the distortion. Do not return.